Hi, my name is Mila. I'm a junior studying English at Harvard, and last semester I made a word game, a literary Mad Lib essentially, based on issue 12 of Chogwa. The goal of my project was to create a single textual object in English that holds the possibility of all 24 translations in the issue. In other words, I wanted to create a poetic structure that recondenses excess and also invites readers to literally share space with and have dialogue with the original text. Here, right below, is a picture of what the first line of the game looks like. And as a non-Korean speaker, I wanted to say before I get into my process that it was a real honor to connect and work so deeply with this poem, but I could never have done it without the support and intellectual work of so many amazing people. So shout out to Chogwa's translators, they're all so awesome. And a special thank you to Sojay for inviting me to make this process video. Let's get into it. So just to quickly recap, Issue 12 features 24 translations of the short poem Na 이 땅에 왔던 은혜 by the Jeju-based poet Hwang Kyum-neo. I really love this poem. I'm going to put it beside me on the screen in Jeju dialect, in standardized Korean, and in English. So if you want to just pause the video on whichever one you want to read before we keep going, you're welcome to do that. Here is the poem in Jeju dialect. Here's the poem in standardized Korean. And then here is one of many translations featured in issue 12 of the poem in English. And this translation is done by Jean. My process for making this Mad Lib took 3 steps. There was a reading step, a listening step, and then a writing step. To begin this process, I did a bit of reading and a bit of listening. The first thing that I read was some essays by translation studies theorists, namely Donmi Choi and Lawrence Venuti, to help me understand the field a little bit better and what the translators might have been thinking about when they were doing their work. I want to say thank you here to the teaching fellow for my class, Eunice Lee, who recommended the readings to me and overall was super supportive in this process, so thank you for doing that. The next thing I did was I listened to the poem both in Jeju dialect and in standardized Korean because I wanted to be as familiar as I could with cadence, with tone, with emotional modulation, all of the sorts of things that poets think about when they're performing their work. And then the third thing I did was I annotated both Romanized versions of the poem, so the Jeju dialect and the standardized Korean Romanized versions of the poem. For rhyme, for near rhyme, and for any other repetition that I could find just by looking at letter patterns. You can see here that the pink line highlights are for verb repetitions, while the rest of the color coding is for rhyme and other letter patterns. At this stage, I also counted lines, I noted line length, and I did a lot of the things that you would typically do when you're close reading a text. Finally, I close read all 24 translations published in issue 12, looking for points of convergence and points of divergence, and I'm going to give a couple of examples. So in these 2 translations, one is done by Sung-Ryu and one is done by Grace. You can see in blue examples of different ways of expressing verb doubling in English. You can see in yellow choices to have rhyming versus repeated N-words. And you can see in green specific words highlighted that were translated differently, namely earth versus land in the title. Other examples show observations about tone and connotation. For example, in these 2 poems, one of which is translated by Eunice and the other one of which is translated by Lauren, you can see in lines around 9, 10, and 11, characterization of the speaker's longing in Eunice's case as still warm, and characterization of the speaker in Lauren's case as not yet cooled. And so it kind of brings up the question of what's the difference between these 2 framings, why would they be translated differently, and why is it important to think about the different implications. Across most translations, I noted the common use of the following things and divergences in the following things, and I'm going to put them up on the screen. So the next part of the process was actually making the game, and it was probably the most complicated bit, so I'm going to try and break it down step by step. The first thing that I did was I went through the poem line by line and tried my best to describe the feeling that I thought each line was trying to evoke in the reader. The best way to explain this, I think, is perhaps in primary or secondary school, you had an assignment where you had to convert a passage of Shakespeare into plain English. I was essentially doing the same thing, but rather than going from poetry into plain English, I was moving from text into subtext. The goal was to evoke the additive connotation of all of the translations without using any of the specific words in them. And if you want to see an example, you can see the highlighted yellow text. Can you see the ways in which these word clusters evoke the additive connotations of line 3 in this case, Emily's translation? When this was done, I added parts of speech within mirror lines and tidied them up a bit. This was the moment when it really started to look like a Mad Lib, and you can see that step of the process in blue. The next challenge was trying to figure out how to account for choices to duplicate words or to invent memetics. I decided to accommodate these by adding directives that were poetically impactful but literally vague. So continuing with line 3, that meant adding the opportunity to double your verb, and you can see what it looked like in the green highlight. As you go further through the poem and through the Mad Lib, to where snowflakes appear, there's a chance to invent a memetic. So in line 7, the reader / Mad Lib player is met with the direction to invent a memetic that attempts to match the soft plosive deflation of falling snow. This line pays homage to the pyong-pyong / pang-pang moment in the original texts. And it's also a directive that you could fill with just a huge variety of words and sounds. In the zine itself, we get translations like pour and pour, like spiral, spiral. But you could also invent something completely new, something completely sonic, or something completely semantic, whatever it is that resonates with you best. And that felt really cool to me. The whole sort of concept reminded me of something that Eunice brought up at one point in office hours, which is that there's no one right translation, just many, many copies without an original. So that's it. Basically, I just repeated the game making part of the process as many times as there were lines in the poem and tried it out for myself to see how it worked and shared it to my friends to see how it worked for people who were less familiar with the translations than I was. As a final point of reflection, I've been thinking a lot about this poem, and I wanted to say that the recursive quality of reading so many translations and working with it for so many hours really reminded me of the writing process itself and the way that final drafts are typically superimposed over many, many iterations. And in a certain way, Chogwa simulated a possible version of Hwang Kiam-neo's kind of intimate, internal, creative process in a way that made me feel really, really close to the poet and also made me feel distant in a way that was pretty unique in my poetry reading experiences. Writing poetry, just in general, really often deals with the conversion from non-linguistic bodily experience to linguistic thought experience. And I've been reflecting on the ways that this may or may not translate to translation across languages. As this project wraps up, I wanted to say that I hope I've done justice to these 24 translators and to the original poet as well. I have so much admiration for their work, and I'm so grateful to be able to share my work with all of you. I really hope that you read issue 12 if you haven't already, and that you do the Mad Lib, and feel free to share it with me and with the zine if you do, because I would love to see what you're doing with it. You can click the link in the description to access the PDF. And thank you so much for listening.